There's certainly people that are all done with fall harvest, maybe a week or so ago, and some other people that'll be at it for a little while. But yeah, we're getting things about wrapped up around here.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Comstock channel. I'm Marlin Bohling with you. Always a treat to visit with you about all things that are ag-related. And today is no different. I'm pleased to welcome aboard Steve Melvin, and he is with the University of Nebraska at Lincoln Extension Service. He is an agronomist in the central part of the state. You cover quite a large geographic area there, Steve. Are you based in Central City, just for a point of reference here?
Yeah, I'm based in Central City, and as Extension in Nebraska works now, a primary responsibility in a couple of counties here of American Hamilton, but also some statewide responsibilities. So depending on the day, how far from home I get, but some days quite a ways.
So for those that aren't familiar with the way Nebraska is laid out, Steve happens to be right in the core of the Corn Belt in the Cornhusker State. So, I mean, he's right in the middle of it all there, kind of in that Platte Valley area there. And there is a lot of corn there and a lot of irrigation too. Now, Steve, you and I talked earlier this year, and you had some concern about how dry it was. And, of course, in the far eastern part of the state this spring, we had the flooding concerns. Where you are not so much, and you rely heavily on irrigation. How did you come through the season?
Yeah, the irrigated fields, other than it's always nice not to have to pump every bit of water onto the crop. Rain's always much appreciated. But yeah, the irrigation did pretty well. Certainly had to keep things running later in the summer. Like you say, earlier in the spring, it was some really great rainfall through June, and even in July we had some pretty good rains. But we got into August and into the fall. It's just been really crazy dry. But yields came out well. Even some of the non-irrigated center pivots have corners that are not irrigated, and depending on where it was at and how much rain got later in the summer, some of those yields even ended up being pretty good. And of course, the non-irrigated stuff, well, just depends again where you're at and what we got. Of course, with the earlier rains always brings a little more hail, and so there's more hail this year around in different places than some other years. But basically, yeah, things came out pretty well. And of course, the non-irrigated wasn't what you want. It wasn't average yields yet by any means, but wasn't like a year ago when a lot of it just wasn't even worth harvesting, which is unusual for this part of the state.
So how far along are you on harvest right now? I don't know if you're making more progress on soybeans or corn right now in that area.
Yeah, the soybeans are pretty much done. The soybeans actually harvest started maybe a week or so later than kind of typical, but then the corn was ready almost at the same time, which is at least 2 weeks early, maybe 3 weeks earlier than normal. It's just it was so warm and dry, and the corn finished up very quickly compared to most years, and then the dry down has just been incredible. And the soybeans kind of were too. We hear stories of people talking about harvesting some 6 moisture soybeans, which of course everybody wants to harvest them at 13, right, and get the maximum volume you can from the crop and sell some water along with it. But there was a lot of 8 and 9 soybeans harvested, and this is the first year I've ever heard in my career of somebody talking about harvesting some 6 moisture soybeans, and the corn's a lot the same way too. I think everything's getting pretty well dried down. There was certainly some of the dry land stuff that probably got pushed pretty hard at the end from just dry weather, but there's an awful lot of that got harvested at 11, 12, 13 moisture. And most of it has been pretty dry. I mean, even way early in this part of Nebraska and on farther west, a lot of the corn, just to get a place to put it, gets just put on the ground. I mean, it gets covered, but so of course when you put it into just a big pile, it's got to be dry because there isn't any way to aerate it very well or to dry it any, and those piles started filling up, way early this year, and so there was just with this hot weather, dry, low humidities, not just terrible winds, but good winds to dry the grain down. We've had dry down. It's just kind of been unreal with the crops this fall.
When you get to moisture levels that low on corn and soybeans, what does that do to the test weight then?
Test weight's fine. It's just a matter of the fact that, I had one farmer call in and ask, he says, I always like to at least sell my soybeans at 12 moisture, and he said I'm harvesting them 8. He says, so how much am I losing there? And so I did the calculations, and if you had 1,000 bushels of soybeans at 8 moisture rather than 12, you'd basically be losing somewhere in the mid 40s. I don't remember the exact number, like 45, 47 bushels more you would be able to sell if you had 12 moisture rather than 8. So on a semi load. So it is, not the end of the world, but it's certainly something that we would rather have a little more moisture in soybeans. I mean, they're always a little bit that way. They're 16, in the morning and someday, and then in the afternoon they're just right at 13, and by evening they're 10. It seems like they really drop moisture quick, and then of course, we shouldn't have any humidity or anything to really even put even have a chance of maintaining the moisture, let alone anything that put some back in. And really, typically in the fall we always have dew on the grass in the morning, and was at a harvesting a corn grower's plot here a couple weeks ago, and there was some dew on the grass that morning actually, and several people as they came in commented, "What in the world is this getting on our shoes? We haven't seen any dew for a month. What is this stuff?" It's kind of joking about it, but it's just been a crazy dry fall, and fires have certainly, when they get started. I mean, every once in a while you have a bearing, start a little fire in the combine or something, and this year, if that happens, it's just crazy. Or, somebody tossed a cigarette out on the highway or something, it just takes off and goes, and it's been a real challenge with the crazy dryness this fall.
Yeah, I have heard that you have had quite a few wildfire outbreaks out there,
Hmm.
especially on days where the wind really picked up, and
Right.
that's not uncommon out there, is it?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It's just a real challenge, and the fire departments have been out just a crazy amount this year, and fortunately nothing around here's gotten real bad and carried away, but around the state there's been a few that's burned, a fair amount. Not huge fires, but certainly more than you'd ever want to have happen. And I know I was, down driving on Interstate 80 here, west of Lincoln, and there's several places where the road ditch is burned out, and that's most likely from people throwing a cigarette out. And you kind of wonder why people do that ever, but a lit one that they didn't put out. But there's just seems like every 5 or 10 miles you see another spot where the road ditch is all burned out. Unfortunately, they got to put out any of them I saw before they got into the fields. But it's just been crazy. Even that grass that's mowed pretty short along the road still burns quite a ways pretty quickly.
How's the quality of the grain then?
It's been good. I haven't had really anybody comment. You get 8 moisture beans, you got to be pretty careful with them. You'll crack quite a few of them, but it's been good. Test weight's been pretty decent this year, and so yeah, the has been good.
So you haven't had any issues with aflatoxin or anything like that?
No, we haven't. That I've heard of. I mean, I don't hear everything across the state. I'm primarily an irrigated area, and that's not something you run into in irrigation. It'd be more of a really drouthy, dryland situation. Typically, I think is when that shows up. So no, I haven't heard anybody talking about that. I'm not saying there's not some around. Certainly don't hear everything.
Well, of course, I have heard anecdotal stories that when you get a little further south on the edges of the Ogallala Aquifer there, that kind of stretches down roughly to the Kansas border, once you get south of that, and it's mainly dry land after that,
Right.
there were quite a few areas where everything just kind of burned up this year.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Again, I haven't been down that way, but I think that's probably true. You get into some of that southeast area. There was not some very good yields over in that area from what I heard. And again, I haven't been down that way, but that's what I've heard.
The big story last winter was the fact that they couldn't get enough corn in southwestern Kansas, where the big feedlot country is.
Mm-hmm.
And I would imagine that probably kind of includes western Nebraska or southwest Nebraska as well. What's the situation now after this harvest? Is everything leveled out now? Has basis maybe evened out a little bit from what it had been?
Well, I never heard anybody saying that, a feed yard or anything that couldn't get corn, and obviously the price would indicate there's plenty around. I know here in this area last last winter, all of them, like I say, we make some outside corn piles that are covered with a plastic tarp, but those were cleaned up really early. A lot of years, we're getting into May or June maybe before some of those get picked up and hauled somewhere. And this year they were gone way early, maybe in the winter even. And but I never did really hear anybody have shortages where they couldn't get grain. Maybe they had to haul it a little farther than they wanted. But there's quite a few ethanol plants in this area, and I didn't really hear any complaints there about not being able to buy as much corn as they wanted locally. But and obviously the price would indicate that there's plenty of corn in the country, right? I mean, it's really pretty discouraging on price this year.
So how are those ethanol plants? You are kind of right in the middle of the majority of ethanol production too, right in that geographic region. Are they operating at pretty much full capacity? Have you heard?
That's what I've heard, that they're pretty much business as usual there, and they seem to be getting along well with what they have. And I don't know too much about it. I know the local plant here at Central City went to making a high protein product where they're pulling protein out of the distiller's grain, and that's gotten to be a nice profit center for them in addition to the ethanol. So I know some of them are trying to do something with feed that's quite a bit different than maybe they did years ago. So that's helped them out some on staying profitable. And I'm sure with the price, there's always a challenge with that. But corn's pretty good for them to buy right now, so that helps on their end of it.
I've heard several people talking about the fact that the harvest was so early on corn this fall that they were entertaining the possibility of double cropping some wheat again. Are you seeing a lot of evidence of that where you are? You normally don't have a lot of wheat there.
No, we don't have much here. There's some people that do plant after soybeans some, and then they kind of relay crop into it, and so there's a little bit of that. But not too much. I mean, cover crops have gotten to be kind of a big thing in this area, and so there's a lot of cover crops get planted, and of course this year most people are, if it's on irrigated land, are running the irrigation center pivot on it to get it to come up. And the other places, they're still planting it, but if it doesn't get some rain on it, it's probably not going to come up this fall, which is pretty discouraging. And that's the deal with wheat. I mean, the wheat hasn't came up super uniform like what you like this fall, because we just haven't had, usually you get an inch rain somewhere along the line and get things soaked up, up in that upper seed bed where the wheat will come up nice and uniformly, but we just haven't had that this year.
So for all intents and purposes, sounds like you can just about put a bow on this fall harvest.
Yeah, we're getting real close. I mean, there's always some people that are done early. There's certainly people that are all done with fall harvest, maybe a week or so ago, and some other people that'll be at it for a little while. But yeah, we're getting things about wrapped up around here.
Glad everything turned out all right. It could have been worse, as we all know. It could have been better, of course, too. But so far, I'm glad to hear that everybody kind of rode through the storm, and now, economically speaking, let's hope we can maybe get some good prices for everybody moving forward.
Well, for sure. Ag profitability wasn't great last year, and this year it's not going to be super great either. But yields ended up nice, which always gives a guy a little bit of something to hang his hat on and feel good about the year. So,
well, Steve, thank you for the update. Good to hear from you again. All the best to you and the team around there. And Steve Melvin. He is an agronomist with the University of Nebraska at Lincoln Extension Service. He's in Central City, Nebraska. And that'll do it for this episode. Thanks again for joining us. For producer Brianne Hendrickson, I'm Marlin Bohling. We'll catch you next time right here on the Comstock Channel. Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.